the 19th century, it was this incredible age of explosive change. We're talking revolutions, new nations, new sciences. But if you were a woman in the West, it was a totally different story. It was a profound paradox, an era that promised universal freedom while at the same time building new walls to contain them. It was like this promise of freedom came with a giant asterisk, and women were really quick to point out that contradiction.
And this gets right to the core of it. This complaint was born from the very same revolutionary fire that was overthrowing kings. Women were actually using the language of liberty, words like despotism, to describe their own situation. They were drawing a direct line from the tyranny of a monarch to the tyranny of a husband.
So you gotta ask, how did this even happen? How did an age that was all about revolution lead to a brand new era of subjugation for women? And maybe even more importantly, how did women fight back? Because this battle for a modern identity, for a sense of self, it wasn't just handed to them. No, it was fought in homes, in courtrooms, and in the pages of books and art. Okay, so let's start with that paradox, that promise of liberty for everyone. Well, like we said, it had a massive catch. As men were moving out into the public world of politics and business, a really powerful new ideology was pushing women in the exact opposite direction. And this quote, wow, it just leaves the backlash out so perfectly. I get this. Notice who's saying it. This isn't some old school traditionalist clinging to the monarchy. No, this is a leader of the new revolutionary order. The very same revolution that was freeing man was actively working to confine woman, making it crystal clear that her proper place was inside the four walls of the home. Okay, but how do you actually justify this new domestic order? Well, the great thinkers of the era, they didn't just fall back on tradition. Nope. They turned to the shiny new authorities of the day, philosophy and science, to argue that this whole setup wasn't a social choice. It was a natural, inevitable fact of life. And the big idea they came up with was this thing called complementarity. Now, it sounds nice and harmonious, right? Opposite, but fitting. But in reality, it was a system of strict regulation. It argued that men and women were this perfect pair of opposites, and each one had a preordained role in life that they just couldn't and shouldn't try to escape. And they backed this up with what they claimed was hard science. Philosophers from the positivist school, people who believed in scientific proof above all else, thinkers like Auguste Comte, they claimed that biology itself proved this hierarchy of the sexes. And that's the key takeaway here. This wasn't just presented as, an opinion. It was framed as objective scientific fact. And boom, here it is. This is that divided world laid out for you. Man was all about intellect, production, the public sphere, reason. And woman, she was emotion, reproduction, the private sphere, piety. It was this really neat, orderly vision for society that left almost no room for individual ambition or, being different. But just as these intellectual walls were going up, you had these powerful new voices starting to tear them right back down. And they did it by using the very same language of liberty and reason that the establishment claimed to value so much. And then came the bombshell. John Stuart Mill, one of the leading philosophers of freedom at the time, he didn't just say the situation was unfair. He called it slavery. I mean, can you imagine? That word was so shocking, it absolutely horrified his contemporaries, from Comte all the way to a young Sigmund Freud. What Mill was arguing was nothing short of revolutionary. He basically said, look, the women you see today, they aren't a product of nature. They're a product of education, of social conditioning. And if they were made that way, well, that means they could be remade. Their subjugation wasn't destiny. It was a system. And any system can be dismantled. And, this wasn't just some philosophical debate. It spilled out into the real world fast. This fight for a self wasn't abstract at all. It became a very concrete struggle for the right to own property, to get an education, to find a job, and even to leave a marriage. Just look at divorce, for example. I mean, this timeline shows you just how slow and painful this progress was. In France, they get the right to divorce during the Revolution, only to have it snatched away again in 1816. And then it took almost 70 years of fighting just to get that right back. This was not a story of steady progress. It was a constant battle, winning ground, losing it, and having to fight for it all over again. Meanwhile, the economy is totally changing.
The rise of big corporations and department stores created this whole new category of white-collar jobs. We're talking secretaries, typists, telephone operators, file clerks, sales girls. For the first time, huge numbers of unmarried women could get jobs outside of being a maid or working in a factory, and that offered at least a glimpse of economic independence.
But here's the thing, basic protections, they were lagging way behind. Just look at this date, 1909. It wasn't until 1909 that France even recognized a woman's right to take unpaid maternity leave without getting fired. Paid leave for most women wouldn't come for a long, long time after that. And maybe the most fundamental battle of all was the battle for the mind. The fight to open up high schools and universities to women was met with this intense resistance. Why? Well, a lot of it was fueled by the fear that an educated woman would just abandon her natural role at home and start competing with men. So we've talked about law and economics, but there was also this huge cultural battle going on, a fight over the very image of what a woman was. Women started moving from being the objects of art to being the creators of it, and in doing so, they started to seize control of their own stories. So you had these three main archetypes floating around. First up, the dominant ideal, the Madonna. The mother, pure, pious. In countless paintings and poems, she was held up as the moral center of the family, the calm, serene guardian of the home. And then, on the complete flip side, you had the seductress. She was basically the embodiment of all the male anxiety about female power and sexuality. In art, you'd see her as this dangerous sphinx or even a vampire, a force that could drain a man's life force and completely disrupt the social order. And archetype number 3, the muse. This is woman as an abstract idea, a source of inspiration for the male genius. She was seen as essential to his creativity, but she was never really seen as a creator in her own right. She was the one to be painted, not the one holding the paintbrush. But here's where it gets really interesting. Women started to smash these molds. Artists like Mary Cassatt and Bertha Morisot, they didn't just paint pictures of women, they totally redefined what it meant to be a woman with a creative vision. They were no longer just the subject on the canvas, they were the ones holding the brush. And this quote from the absolutely brilliant intellectual Lou Andreas Salome, it just nails the spirit of this emerging new woman. She's saying it wasn't enough to just say no to all the old roles. Real freedom, true freedom, meant you had to define a new way of being, entirely on your own terms. So, when you look at the big picture, the 19th century really did set the stage for our world today. It forged the conflicts and the conversations we're still having about public versus private life, work and family, personal ambition versus social expectations, and it really makes you think. Looking back at their struggles for education, for equal pay, for control over their own lives, which of those battles are we still fighting right now?